The gavel wasn't for land or cattle. It was for a child. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood on a crate in the dust of the Cedar Ridge gathering, her value being shouted to the highest bidder. And every soul in that crowd was about to learn a terrible lesson. When a man like Elias Vance decides to intervene, he doesn't ask for permission. He brings a thunder that splits the ground and divides a town forever. This is the story of Elias Vance, a man who believed his fighting days were over, and the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, which had quietly accepted a terrible tradition. In the summer of 1878, on the high plains where law was just a suggestion, the price of a human life was about to be called. But what happens when the one man with nothing left to lose decides that some lines cannot be crossed? The answer would tear Cedar Ridge in two. Elias Vance arrived in Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1877, a man wearing his history like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. He'd buried his wife and young son back in Ohio 2 winters before, victims of a fever that took the kind but spared the guilty. After that, the wide-open silence of the Nebraska Territory was all he could stand. He bought a small, struggling spread 5 miles west of town, good water, poor grass, and spoke to his horses more than he spoke to people. Cedar Ridge was less a town and more a stubborn idea. A single muddy street with a mercantile, a smithy, 2 saloons, and about 150 souls clinging to the hope that the railroad surveyors were telling the truth. The law was Marshal John Teague, a tired man with bad knees who spent more time settling disputes over wandering cattle than anything else. The real power sat with Mayor Josiah Hendricks, who owned the mercantile and the largest grain contract with the Army fort 80 miles north. And then there was the tradition. They didn't call it an auction. The word they used was placement. Every spring and fall, after the wagon trains came through or when a mining camp failed up in the hills, children would appear. Orphans, half-orphans, or kids from families so broken by debt that a labor contract seemed the only mercy. They'd stand on the porch of the mercantile. Hendricks or the blacksmith, a man named Silas Crow, would read out terms, 8 years of service for room and board, to a sponsoring household or ranch. Bids weren't for the child, they insisted. They were for assuming the cost of their upkeep. The difference was a fiction everyone agreed to believe. Elias had seen it once the previous fall. A boy, maybe 12, hollow-eyed and shaking. He'd watched a rancher named Briggs win the bid, examine the boy's teeth like a horse and lead him away. The air had felt thick and wrong, but Elias had turned, mounted up, and ridden home. The memory of that turning haunted him. It was the kind of quiet betrayal a man makes when his own pain is a loud enough noise. The summer of '78 was punishing. Heat leaned on the plains from dawn till dark, and the creek by Elias' land ran shallow and warm. He came into town on the second Thursday of July for nails and salt. The gathering was already forming. He felt it before he saw it, a particular charged stillness in the air outside the mercantile. More men than usual, maybe 30 or 40. Hendricks was on the porch. Silas Crow stood beside him, hammering a makeshift plank onto 2 barrels to make a platform. And then Elias saw her. A little girl. She was painfully thin, with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat, tangled and dirty. Her dress was a faded gray sackcloth, too big for her. Her eyes, a wide, startling blue, scanned the crowd not with curiosity but with a flat, exhausted terror that knew what was coming. She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. She was preternaturally still, as if moving might break some spell and make it all real. A man Elias didn't recognize, whip thin, with a nervous Adam's apple, stood behind her, a hand on her shoulder. Her father, a guardian. He looked like a man waiting to be rid of a burden. Hendricks cleared his throat, the official sound cutting through the murmur. "Good people, we have a minor in need of sponsorship. Child is female, aged approximately 7 years, healthy, capable of light domestic work. Terms are a standard 8-year indenture for full upkeep. Bidding starts at $20 to cover incurred debts." The words were dry, bureaucratic. They made the thing happening feel legal, sanitized. $20, the price of a good saddle. A voice from the crowd, 22. Another 25. Elias felt a heat that had nothing to do with the sun rise up from his chest. His hands, holding his reins, were slick with sweat. He saw the girl's gaze sweep over the bidding men, not seeing faces, seeing futures. He saw the man behind her give her shoulder a little shake, a silent command to stand straight, to look valuable. 30, called a stout woman in a bonnet. She ran the boarding house. She had a reputation for hard bargains and harder work. 32, said a ranch hand, tipping his hat to the woman, for the Dowd place. The bidding was slow, methodical, an investment. Elias' mind split. One part screamed, a raw, wordless noise from the hole where his own child lived. The other part, the survival part, calculated. This is not your fight. This is the way of this place. Walk away. You walked away before. Silas Crow leaned toward Hendricks, murmured something. Hendricks nodded. Current bid is 32. Fair warning, going once. The little girl's eyes finally landed on Elias. They locked onto his. In them, he didn't see a plea. He saw a resignation so complete it mirrored the one he carried in his own soul. The recognition was a physical blow. Going twice. The survival part of Elias Vance disintegrated. Stop. The word wasn't loud. It was low, graveled, but it cut through the dry air like a knife. Every head turned. Elias stepped away from his horse, his boots crunching in the dust. He walked toward the porch, the crowd parting before him. Hendricks blinked, his officious mask slipping into irritation. Mr. Vance, the bid is in process. You will not sell this child, Elias said. He reached the foot of the porch steps and stopped, looking up at the girl. The man behind her tightened his grip on her shoulder. This is a legal contract of indenture, overseen by. It's a flesh market, Elias said, his voice still quiet but every syllable carried. And you will take your hands off her, now. A stunned silence gripped the crowd. No one interrupted the placement. Ever. Silas Crow shifted his weight, his hand drifting subtly toward the heavy hammer on his belt. The man holding the girl, confused, looked to Hendricks for direction. Hendricks's face flushed. You are out of order, Vance. This child's guardian has entered into this agreement willingly. The debt is $32. If you are not bidding, you will step back. Elias didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the man holding the girl. I said let her go. The man, frightened now, released her shoulder as if burned. The girl stumbled forward half a step, her terrified eyes fixed on Elias. Elias moved then. He took the 2 porch steps in one stride, placed himself squarely between the girl and the men. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, and in that moment he seemed to fill the entire space. He looked down at Mayor Hendricks. The bid, Elias said, is void. You have no authority here, Hendricks sputtered, but the confidence was leaking out of him, replaced by a flustered rage. I just established it. Elias turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the frozen crowd. He saw faces etched with shock, some with anger, a few with a dawning, uncomfortable shame. He saw the ranch hand who'd bid $32 look at the ground. He saw the boarding house woman shake her head in disgust, but not at him, at the disruption. He knelt down, bringing himself to the girl's eye level. The crowd held its breath. Up close, she was even more fragile. He could smell the dust and fear on her. He kept his hands at his sides, making no move to touch her. What's your name? He asked, his voice softening just for her. She stared at him, her lips trembling. A full minute passed, then a whisper so faint it was almost lost. Lydia. Lydia, he repeated. He nodded once. My name is Elias. You're not going with any of these people. Do you understand? She gave the tiniest nod, a flicker of confusion in the ocean of fear. Elias stood back up. The confrontation was over, but the real battle, he knew, had just begun. He had just shattered the most powerful unspoken rule in Cedar Ridge. He had taken their transaction and broken it in front of everyone. And as he looked out at the sea of faces, he didn't see a community. He saw the lines being drawn. The division was instant and it was absolute. Silas Crow finally found his voice, a low growl. "You can't just take her, Vance." Elias turned his head, meeting the blacksmith's glare. "I didn't take her. I prevented a theft." He finally looked back at the sputtering mayor. "The debt is $32, you said." Hendricks, seething, gave a sharp nod. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out his money roll. He counted out $32 in worn bills. He didn't hand it to Hendricks. He held it out to the thin, nervous man who had brought the girl. The man stared at it like it was a snake. "Take it," Elias said. "Consider your debt paid. Now get out of my sight." The man snatched the money and, without a backward glance at the girl, melted into the crowd and was gone. Elias looked down at Lydia. "Come on." He didn't offer his hand. He simply started walking down the porch steps, expecting her to follow. For a second she didn't move, paralyzed. Then, a desperate survival instinct older than 7 years kicked in. She scrambled after him, her small hand reaching out to clutch desperately at the back of his dust-covered coat. He led her to his horse. He mounted first, then leaned down, offering an arm. She stared at it, then at the crowd still watching in dead silence. She took his arm. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She was rigid, trembling. Elias gathered the reins. He looked one last time at the porch, at Mayor Hendricks, whose face was now a cold, hard mask of fury, at Silas Crow, who looked ready to commit murder, at the people of Cedar Ridge, whose neat, brutal world had just been upended by a grieving rancher and a silent little girl. He didn't say another word. He turned his horse and nudged it into a walk, moving slowly down the main street and out of town, the eyes of the community boring into his back. The silence behind him was more violent than any shout. It was the sound of a town deciding what to do with a man who had just declared war on its conscience. And in that silence, Elias knew two things with perfect clarity. He had just made an enemy of every powerful person in Cedar Ridge. And he could not, give the child back. The 5 miles back to his ranch stretched longer than any distance Elias had ever known. The girl, Lydia, sat rigid before him in the saddle, her small hands gripping the horn so tightly her knuckles were white moons. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just held on as if the horse might dissolve beneath her. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, his mind a storm of grim calculation. He had acted on an impulse that felt like the first true thing he'd done in years. Now he had to live with the consequences, and so did she. His homestead was a lonely cluster of structures, a single-room cabin, a lean-to stable, a corral. It wasn't a place for a child. As he lifted her down, her legs nearly buckled. She stared at the cabin as if it were another kind of trap. "Inside," he said, his voice rough from disuse and tension. He pushed the door open. The interior was spare and dusty. A stone fireplace, a rough table, one chair, a bedroll in the corner, a few tins of food on a shelf. It was the dwelling of a man who was just passing through, even after a year. Lydia stood just inside the doorway, her back pressed against the wall, making herself small. Elias felt a surge of helplessness. He knew cattle and weather and grief. He didn't know little girls. "You hungry?" he asked. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He found a can of peaches, opened it, and slid it onto the table with a spoon. She eyed it but didn't move. "It's food," he said, stating the obvious. "Eat." Slowly, like a wary animal, she crept to the table, climbed onto the chair, and began to eat with a quiet, desperate focus that told him more about her last few days than any story could. He turned away, giving her the privacy of the meal, and went to tend to his horse. The normalcy of the chore was a relief. When he came back, the can was empty. She was back against the wall, watching him. "We need to get you cleaned up," he said. He fetched a bucket, pumped water at the well outside, and set it to warm by the fire. He found an old, soft shirt of his that would swamp her. "I'll be outside," he said, and stepped out, closing the door behind him. He stood on his porch, looking east toward town. The sky was turning the deep orange of late afternoon. In the distance, a rider was coming. a single rider moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Elias didn't move. He watched the plume of dust grow closer until he recognized the slump-shouldered shape of Marshal John Teague. Teague reined up a respectful distance from the porch. He didn't dismount. His face was unreadable, weathered leather under his hat brim. Elias. Marshal. Teague sighed, a long, weary sound. Hell of a thing you did today. Was it? The marshal ignored the question. Hendricks is in a state. Silas Crow is talking about property rights and breach of contract. That fella who brought the girl in, he lit out right after you left. Can't get a straight story from anyone. Then there's nothing to discuss, Elias said. Not quite. Teague shifted in his saddle. The way they tell it, you disrupted a lawful proceeding and essentially stole a minor under contract. Hendricks is talking about sending to the county seat for a proper judge. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The law, when it finally arrived out here, was a clumsy, distant thing, easily manipulated by the man with the most money or the loudest voice. Hendricks had both. What's your telling? Teague asked. My telling is a child was being sold on a porch. I bought out the debt. She's free. Her guardian agreed to that. Her guardian took the money and ran, Elias said flatly. He didn't look back once. You call that a guardian? Teague was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning Elias' face, then glancing toward the closed cabin door. What are you aiming to do with her, Elias? You can't raise a child out here. This ain't a life for a little girl. I don't know, Elias admitted, the truth sharp in his mouth. But I know what wasn't going to happen to her. That's a start. The marshal nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. Hendricks won't let this lie. That placement system. It's how he controls labor in this valley, keeps wages low, keeps people beholden. You didn't just take a girl, Elias. You kicked the cornerstone out of his little empire. He'll come for it. I'm not giving her back. I'm not asking you to, Teague surprised him. The older man looked tired, deeply tired. I'm telling you to get your story straight and to watch your back. Silas Crow, he's not just a blacksmith, he's the muscle. And he's loyal to Hendricks because Hendricks makes him rich off army contracts. Teague turned his horse. I'll tell them I spoke to you. I'll tell them the child is here and safe. That might buy you a day, maybe two. Why? Elias asked. Why would you do that? The marshal didn't look back. Because I've got a daughter back in Indiana, about her age. He nudged his horse and started back down the trail, a lone figure swallowed by the gathering dusk. Elias went back inside. Lydia was sitting by the fire, swamped in his oversized shirt, her hair damp and combed roughly with his fingers. She looked tiny and impossibly clean. She looked at him with those huge blue eyes. That was the law, he said. He's not going to take you. She just stared, processing. Then she whispered, the bad man will come. A chill went through him. What bad man, Lydia? The one with the loud voice, the hammer man. Silas Crow, she'd recognized the threat. Elias knelt by the fire closer to her level. Did he hurt you? She shook her head quickly, but her eyes darted away. Not him then, but someone. The man who brought you to town, who was he? Uncle Jade, she whispered. Mama's brother, after Mama, after the river took her. He said he had debts. He said I had to be brave and stand quiet and I'd have a new home. Her voice was a monotone reciting instructions. He said not to cry or no one would want me. Elias closed his eyes for a second. A mother lost, a feckless uncle selling his own niece to settle gambling debts or bar tabs. It was a story as old as the frontier, and it made him sick. Your Uncle Jade is gone. He won't be back. She absorbed this, then asked the most terrifying question of all. Are you my new home? The word hung in the air. Home. He couldn't lie to her. I don't know yet, Lydia, but I promise you this, you are safe here tonight, and no one is going to make you stand on a porch again. You have my word. She searched his face, looking for the truth in it. Slowly, she gave a single nod. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was a temporary truce. The next morning, the division in Cedar Ridge became real. Elias rode in at first light, alone, leaving Lydia hidden in the cabin with strict orders to bolt the door and not answer for anyone but him. He needed supplies, proper food for a child, cloth, maybe even a second chair. The town felt different. The usual morning murmur was absent. Men leaning on porch posts fell silent as he passed. The woman at the well stopped drawing water to watch him. He felt the weight of their judgment, a physical pressure. At the mercantile, the door was open, but the atmosphere inside was frosty. Mayor Josiah Hendricks stood behind the counter himself, not his clerk. He was a tall, stern man with a neatly trimmed beard, and today his eyes were like chips of flint. Silas Crow leaned against a barrel of flour, his massive arms crossed. The blacksmith was in his 40s, all coiled strength and simmering violence. "Vance," Hendricks said, the word an accusation. "Hendricks, I need supplies." "We are closed to you." Elias looked around the stocked shelves. "Store looks open." "To lawful citizens engaged in lawful commerce," Hendricks said smoothly. "You are currently in possession of stolen property. Until that matter is resolved, you will not trade here." So it began, an economic siege. Elias met his gaze. "The child is not property, and I paid the debt in front of witnesses." "You interfered with a binding contract." Silas Crow's voice was a low rumble. "That money wasn't yours to pay. The contract was with the Dowd Ranch. You violated commercial law." "There was no contract signed," Elias fired back. "Just a man shouting numbers at a scared kid. That's not law. That's barbarism with a price tag." Crow took a step forward, but Hendricks held up a hand. "Your romantic notions are not our concern, Vance. That child was to be placed in a Christian household where she would learn useful skills and have structure. You have no wife, no woman's touch, a homestead that is little more than a claim shack. You are in no position to provide. This is about her welfare." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. "Her welfare," Elias repeated softly. "You mean her labor value." Hendricks's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing pure, venomous anger. "You are a disruptive element. You have been since you arrived. You keep to yourself. You contribute nothing to this community, and now you seek to undermine the systems that allow this community to survive. We will not have it." "Systems?" Elias scoffed. He looked from Hendricks to Crow. "I see one man who wants cheap, bound labor and another who enjoys the power of making it happen. Where's the welfare in that?" "That's enough." Crow pushed off the barrel. "You've had your say. Now get out. And don't come back until you're ready to hand that girl over to proper authorities." Elias knew he wouldn't get his supplies. He also knew this was just the opening move. He turned and walked out, feeling their eyes on his back. As he mounted his horse, he saw other faces in windows and doors. Not all were hostile. He saw fear, yes, but also a furtive curiosity, even a spark of something that might have been admiration. The town was split, just as he'd felt leaving the day before. He rode to the other end of town, to a small, run-down shack on the edge of the settlement where an old Mexican woman named Abuela Marisol sold remedies and trinkets. She was outside, hanging dried herbs. She watched him approach with dark, knowing eyes. "You are the one," she said, her English lightly accented. "The one who took the little asterisk Pajero from the cage." "I need supplies," Elias said, dismounting. "Flour, sugar, some cloth. They won't sell to me at the mercantile." She studied him for a long moment. "It is not wise to cross Josiah Hendricks." "I didn't have a choice." She smiled, a thin, wise curve of her lips. "The best choices often look that way." She waved him inside her shack. It was crowded with jars and bundles, smelling of sage and earth. She began to gather items for him. "The girl, she is well. She's scared, she's clean, she's eating." "Good, fear is a poison. It must be washed out with safety." She handed him a small sack of flour. "Hendricks, he will not stop with refusing you goods. He will tell others not to do business with you. The smith will not shoe your horse. The mill will not grind your grain. I have a little put by. I can ride to Fort Randall for supplies if I have to. This is not just about supplies, Senor Asterisk, she said, her voice dropping. It is about isolation. He will make you an island. Then when you are alone and weak, he will send Crow to take back what you stole. The marshal. He is a good man, but he is one man with bad knees. He cannot stand against them all. Elias felt the truth of her words settle like a stone. What do you know about the placements, Abuela? Her face grew solemn. I know that 2 years ago a boy placed with the grain merchant was found dead in a barn. They called it an accident, a fall. I saw the body. The bruises were not from a fall. She looked away. I know that Silas Crow's last apprentice, a boy of 14, ran away and was never found. Crow said he was ungrateful. Hendricks said the law had no jurisdiction over a private labor contract. She met Elias' eyes. It is a system that eats the weak. And you have just shown everyone it can be challenged. That is why they hate you. You have held up a mirror and they do not like what they see. Elias paid her for the supplies, adding extra. She tried to refuse it, but he insisted. As he tied the sack to his saddle, she touched his arm. There are some in this town, good people, who feel shame in their hearts for what they have allowed. They are silent, but they are there. You are not as alone as they want you to feel. He thanked her and rode for home, her warning echoing in his mind. Isolation, then force. When he crested the final rise overlooking his homestead, he saw the smoke first. A thin, greasy column not from his chimney. His heart slammed against his ribs. He kicked his horse into a gallop. It wasn't the cabin. It was his stable. The linta was ablaze, flames licking up the dry timber. His 2 other horses were screaming, trapped in the corral beside it. And there, standing near the water pump, was Lydia. She was hurling dippers of water at the base of the fire, her face streaked with soot and terror. Elias leaped from his horse before it fully stopped. "Get back," he yelled, sprinting past her. He tore open the corral gate, slapping the rumps of his panicked horses to drive them out to safety. Then he grabbed the water bucket and joined Lydia, throwing water on the flames that were threatening to spread to the cabin. It took 20 minutes of frantic work to beat back the fire. The linta was a loss, a charred, smoking skeleton, but the cabin was saved. The horses were safe, grazing nervously nearby. Exhausted, Elias sank to his knees in the damp dirt, coughing. Lydia stood a few feet away, shaking, the empty dipper still in her hand. He looked at her, really looked. She wasn't just scared. She was furious. Her small jaw was clenched, her blue eyes blazing. "Did you see who did this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, a sharp, furious motion. "2 men on horses. They threw a lantern. They saw me in the window. One of them laughed." "Could you describe them?" "The hammer man," she said, "and another with a yellow neckerchief. Silas Crow, and one of his friends, probably a ranch hand from the Dowd place. They hadn't come to take her, not yet. They'd come to send a message, a warning shot. See how vulnerable you are. See how easily we can burn your world down." Elias looked from the ruined stable to the determined, soot-streaked face of the little girl who had fought the fire to save the only shelter she had. The helplessness he'd felt evaporated, burned away in the heat of the flames. It was replaced by a cold, clear rage. They had crossed a line. They had threatened his home, and in doing so, they had threatened her. The temporary truce was over. This was now a war. He got to his feet. "Go inside, Lydia. Bolt the door." "Where are you going?" Her voice was small but sharp. Elias picked up his rifle from where it leaned by the cabin door. He checked the load, his movements deliberate, calm. "I'm going to town," he said, "to return a message." Elias Vance rode into Cedar Ridge with a purpose that changed the air. It was late afternoon, and the long shadows made the street a canyon of twilight. He didn't ride to the mercantile. He rode straight to the blacksmith's shop, the heart of Silas Crow's domain. The forge was cold, but Crow was there, talking with 2 other men, the one with the yellow neckerchief, and a ranch hand Elias recognized from the Dowd spread. They fell silent as he approached. Elias didn't dismount. He sat his horse, the rifle resting across his saddle, and looked down at the three men. "My stable's ashes," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet street. "A little girl is crying in my cabin, covered in soot. You're a brave bunch, setting fire to a building with a child inside." Crow stepped forward, a nasty smile on his face. "Got a problem with fire, Vance. Should be more careful with your lanterns. Dry weather like this." "The girl saw you," Elias said, his eyes locked on Crow's. "She described you, and your friend here with the yellow rag." The man in the neckerchief shifted uneasily. Crow's smile didn't waver. "A frightened child's story. Who's gonna believe that over the word of upstanding citizens? You're the stranger here, the one who steals children." A small crowd was gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Elias saw the fear in their faces, but also a flicker of something else: anticipation. "I'm not here to argue," Elias said. He raised his voice so the gathering crowd could hear. "I'm here to tell you and everyone listening that the next man who sets foot on my land with ill intent will be buried on it. This isn't a warning. It's a statement of fact." The directness of it, the calm violence in the promise, sucked the breath from the street. Even Crow's smirk faltered for a second. "You can't threaten," the yellow neckerchief man started. "I just did," Elias cut him off, finally shifting his gaze to him. "And you especially. You laughed while my home burned. I won't forget that." He turned his horse then, a deliberate, slow movement that showed no fear of having his back to them. He walked his horse down the center of the street, feeling dozens of eyes on him. He stopped in front of the marshal's office. John Teague was already in the doorway, having heard everything. "Elias," Teague said, his voice weary. "John, arson on my place. 2 perpetrators identified. Are you going to do your job, or do I need to redefine the terms of this conflict myself?" Teague stepped out, closing the door behind him. He lowered his voice. "I heard. I also heard Crow's version. A tragic accident. A carelessly placed lantern. Who do you think a circuit judge who dines at Hendrix's table twice a year is going to believe?" "So that's it?" Elias asked, the cold rage simmering. "They burn my property, terrorize a child, and the law just shrugs." "The law is a tool, Elias. Out here, it's a blunt tool owned by the man with the heaviest purse." Teague rubbed his bad knee. "I can write up a report. I can send it to the county seat. It'll be filed, forgotten. That's the best I can do." "That's nothing." "It's reality." Teague looked past him at the crowd still loitering. "You made your point. Now they know you'll fight. That changes their calculations, but Hendrix won't back down. You've cost him more than a $32 indenture. You've cost him face. And in a place like this, face is currency." Elias knew he was right. The legal system was a dead end. This would be settled in the dirt, one way or another. He nodded stiffly and turned his horse for home. But the retaliation wasn't finished. It was just changing shape. 2 days later, a rider came from the direction of Fort Randall. He wasn't a soldier. He was a stern-looking man in a dark suit, carrying a leather satchel. He asked for Elias Vance at the Mercantile and was directed to the homestead. Elias met him on the porch, Lydia watching silently from the window. "Mr. Vance, I am Arthur Finch, attorney at law, representing the interests of Mr. Josiah Hendrix and the Cedar Ridge Town Council." Elias felt a new kind of chill. "Get to it." Finch opened his satchel and produced a formal-looking document. "It is a petition to the territorial court, alleging you are unlawfully detaining a minor, one Lydia, surname unknown. Given the absence of familial guardian and your own unsuitability as documented by upstanding members of the community, Mr. Hendrix, as mayor, seeks to have the child placed in protective custody until proper guardianship can be established by the court." Elias took the paper. The language was dense, legalistic, but the meaning was clear. They were using the law, after all, not to punish him for arson, but to take Lydia away through a slow, expensive, bureaucratic process. They would tie him up in court, drain what little money he had on lawyers, and eventually a judge in some distant city would grant custody to the community, which meant Hendricks. They cite your unstable temperament, your violent threats publicly made, your lack of permanent female companionship, and the recent destructive fire on your property as evidence of an unsafe environment, Finch said smoothly. A hearing is set for 6 weeks from now in Lincoln. Failure to appear will result in a default judgment in favor of the petitioner. 6 weeks, 150 miles away, an impossible journey with a child into a legal arena where he had no allies. It was a masterstroke, clean, legal, and utterly ruthless. You can tell Hendricks, Elias said, crumpling the paper slowly in his fist, that he can take his petition and— I am merely the messenger, Mr. Vance, Finch interrupted, unperturbed. The court date is set. I would advise you to secure representation. He tipped his hat, remounted, and rode away. Elias stood on the porch, the crumpled paper in his hand, the walls closing in. Isolation, then law, then force. Abuela Marisol had been exactly right. That night, as Elias tried to plan, a soft knock came at the cabin door. He grabbed his rifle, motioning Lydia to stay in the corner. Who is it? John Teague. Elias opened the door. The marshal stood alone in the dark. He looked past Elias to Lydia, gave her a small, awkward nod, then focused on Elias. Heard about the lawyer? Yeah. Finch is good. He's from Omaha. Hendricks is pulling out all the stops. This will cost him a fortune, but he's willing to spend it to break you. I can't go to Lincoln, Elias said. I can't leave the place undefended, and I can't drag her across the territory into a courtroom where they've already bought the judge. I know, Teague hesitated, then stepped inside, lowering his voice. There might be another way, but you're not going to like it. I'm listening. Her mother's brother, Jade, the one who brought her here, he's her only living kin, right? Elias nodded, a sick feeling growing in his gut. If a blood relative, a proper guardian, were to show up and reclaim her, Hendricks's petition falls apart. It has no standing. The court deals with orphans and abandoned children, not kids with uncles. Her uncle sold her, Elias said, his voice tight. He did, but what if he had a change of heart? What if he heard what happened, felt remorse, and came to take his niece to live with family back east? Teague's meaning was clear. A story like that told right to Hendricks and Finch. It ends their legal play. It gets them off your back. Elias stared at him. You're suggesting I find the man who sold his own niece into servitude and convince him to pretend to be a loving guardian. That's your solution. It's a way out, Elias. A way that doesn't end with you shot dead by Sila's crow or losing everything in a court you can't win. Teague's frustration boiled over. Don't you see? This is how you survive. You make the ugly, practical choice. And what happens to Lydia? Elias asked, looking over at the girl who was watching them, understanding more than she should. Do I just hand her back to the man who traded her for whiskey money? How is that better? She wouldn't actually go with him, Teague said, dropping his voice to a whisper. He shows up, makes his claim in front of witnesses, gets her released to him. Then on the road out of town, he has an accident, gets lost. She runs away, finds her way back to you. A tragedy, but she's legally free of Hendricks's claim. Her guardian disappeared. You take her in out of compassion. It's messy, but it works. It was a corrupt, dirty, frontier solution. It required trusting a man who was inherently untrustworthy and orchestrating a lie that could unravel in a dozen ways. Elias felt soiled just hearing it. And if Jade decides he actually wants to keep her, or sell her again down the line, Elias asked. Teague had no answer. I appreciate you trying, John, Elias said finally. But I won't trade one monster for another, even for a clean exit. I made her a promise. The marshal sighed, defeat on his face. Then you're down to 2 choices, run or fight them all. After Teague left, Elias sat at his table, the weight of it all pressing down. Running meant becoming a fugitive, living on the dodge with a child. fighting meant. He didn't know what it meant. It meant standing his ground against the entire power structure of Cedar Ridge until one side broke. Lydia came over and stood beside his chair. She didn't speak. She just leaned her head against his arm. The simple, wordless gesture of trust was a weight heavier than any threat. The next morning, a second visitor arrived. Not a lawyer or a marshal. It was the ranch hand from the Dowd place who had been with Crow the day before. He rode up alone, his hat in his hand, looking nervous. "Mr. Vance." Elias stepped out wary. "What do you want?" "The name's Ben Willis. I was there at the fire." He swallowed hard. "I didn't throw the lantern, that was Sela's, and I didn't laugh. That was Dale, the fellow with the neckerchief. I held the horses." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I got a little sister back in Tennessee, about her age." He glanced toward the cabin window. "What Crow said after when we rode off. It didn't sit right," he said. "That'll smoke the vermin out. Next time we burn the cabin with them in it." Ben looked sick. He meant it. Hendricks is telling him to be careful, to let the law work, but Crow, he's angry. You shamed him in front of the whole town. He wants blood. The confirmation was no surprise, but hearing it made it real. "Why take the risk to tell me?" "Because if something happens to that little girl," Ben shook his head, "I couldn't live with it. There's a few of us hands on the smaller spreads. We talk. We ain't all with Hendricks. What you did, it was right. But you can't stay here. They'll kill you and they'll take her anyway." "Where would I go?" Ben leaned forward. "Reverend Albright over at the Pine Grove Mission, 30 miles north. He's a good man. He doesn't answer to Hendricks. He takes in folks who need help. If you can get to him, he might be able to get word to the Indian Bureau or the Army about her. Get her proper papers out of this territory." It was a thread of hope, thin but real, a destination. "Thank you, Ben." "Don't thank me, just go, and go soon. Crow is gathering a few of the rougher boys from the saloon, talking about upholding community order. You got maybe 2 days." Ben rode off, leaving Elias with a terrible decision. Run toward a distant, uncertain sanctuary or stay and make a stand that looked more and more like a suicide pact. He spent the day in a flurry of activity. He repaired what he could of the stable. He packed what supplies he had. He told Lydia they might have to take a trip. She asked if they were coming back. He couldn't answer. That evening, as the sun dipped below the plains, a third rider appeared. This one Elias knew. Abuela Marisol riding an old mule, a bundle strapped behind her. She dismounted stiffly. "You are leaving." "How did you know?" "The wind brings news. The Willis boy has a good heart but a loose tongue. People are talking. Crow is drinking heavily at the saloon, talking loud about vermin and cleanup." She handed him the bundle. "Food, medicine for the child, a little money." Elias was taken aback. "I can't take your money, Abuela." "You can and you will. This is not for you, it is for her." She looked toward the cabin. "This evil, it has grown in the shadow of our silence for too long. You held up a light. Now the rats are scattering, but they are also biting. You must go." "I don't want to run," Elias confessed, the admission painful. "Running toward safety is not cowardice, it is strategy. Live to fight another day on ground of your choosing." She fixed him with her sharp eyes. "But hear this, Elias Vance. The division you saw, it is real. Hendricks and Crow think they speak for the town. They do not. There are many who are ashamed. When you are gone, they will have to look at what they allowed. That shame is a seed. It will grow." He helped her back onto her mule. "Thank you." "Vaya con Dios," she said. "Go with God and do not look back." Elias made his final decision that night. They would leave at first light for Pine Grove Mission. It was the only play that kept Lydia safe. But Silas Crow was done waiting. Elias was wrenched from a shallow sleep by the sound of his horse screaming in alarm from the corral. Then a gunshot. Not a rifle shot, the boom of a shotgun. Then another. He was on his feet, rifle in hand, before the echoes died. He peered out the window. In the moonlight, he saw four shapes on horses, silhouetted at his corral. One of them was holding a shotgun. His horse, the one he'd ridden for 5 years, was on the ground, moving feebly. They'd shot his animals. The door wasn't enough. They'd burn it this time. He knew it with a cold certainty. "Lydia," he hissed. She was already awake, crouched by the bed, her eyes wide pools of terror. "The root cellar, now. Don't make a sound. Don't come out for anything." He pushed aside the rug and yanked open the heavy hatch in the floor. It led to a small, shallow cellar for potatoes. She scrambled down into the darkness. He met her eyes for 1 second before closing the hatch and dragging the rug back over it. Then he took his position at the window. They were dismounting now, 4 men. Silas Crow, huge and unmistakable, Dale with the yellow neckerchief, 2 others he didn't recognize. Crow was carrying a can, kerosene. They thought he was asleep. They thought they'd already won. Elias raised his rifle, rested the barrel on the windowsill and took aim. Not at Crow, at the kerosene can in his hand. He breathed out. The world narrowed to the sight picture. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was immense in the silent night. The kerosene can exploded in a fireball that engulfed Silas Crow's arm and chest. Crow screamed, a raw, animal sound of agony, and stumbled back, beating at the flames. The other 3 men froze, stunned, blinded by the sudden fire. Elias worked the lever of his rifle, the spent cartridge clinking on the floor. He fired again. This shot took Dale in the leg, spinning him to the ground with a cry. The other 2 men scrambled for their horses, firing wildly toward the cabin. Bullets splintered the wood near the window. Elias ducked, then popped up and fired a 3rd time. One of the fleeing men jerked but kept going, hauling himself onto his horse. The other was already riding hell for leather into the darkness. In seconds it was over. The roar of the flames was gone, leaving only the acrid smell of burnt kerosene and the moaning of the wounded. Silas Crow was rolling in the dirt, his shirt smoldering. Dale was writhing, clutching his leg. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his rifle ready. He walked slowly toward the 2 men. Crow looked up at him, his face a mask of pain and hatred. "You're dead, Vance," Crow gasped. "You're a dead man." Elias stood over him. "You came to my home to kill me and a child. You shot my animals. The law might not care, but I do." He raised his voice. "You too. Listen to me. You go back to Hendricks. You tell him the next delegation he sends to my land, I won't aim for the can. I won't aim for the leg. You tell him the war he wanted is here, and I am not running." He turned and walked back to his cabin, leaving the wounded men in the dirt. He had drawn a line in blood and fire. There was no going back now. The quiet standoff was over. The real battle for Cedar Ridge's soul had just begun, and Elias Vance, the grieving rancher who just wanted to be left alone, was now the spark in the powder keg. The silence after the gunfire was the loudest sound Elias had ever heard. The only noises were the dying whimpers of his horse in the corral and the ragged, pained breathing of the 2 men he'd left in the dirt. Silas Crow was still conscious, his burnt arm curled against his chest, his eyes gleaming with hate in the moonlight. Dale had passed out from the pain of his shattered leg. Elias didn't tend to them. He walked back into the cabin, his hands steady but his mind roaring. He pulled aside the rug and opened the root cellar hatch. "Lydia, it's over. You can come out." For a long moment there was nothing. Then a small, soot-streaked face appeared in the darkness below. She climbed out, her body trembling violently. She looked at the rifle in his hand, then at the door. "Are they dead?" she whispered. "No," he said, "but they won't be coming inside tonight." He led her to the table and sat her down. He pumped water from the jug, wet a cloth, and began to wipe the grime from her face. She let him, her eyes huge and fixed on him. The shock was setting in for both of them. He knew the clock was ticking. The 2 men who had ridden off would reach town within the hour. Hendricks would know his strong-arm play had failed catastrophically. The next move was unpredictable. A full-on mob, a siege. Elias had maybe until dawn. He was weighing whether to run right then in the dark when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Not a charge, a slow, deliberate walk, many horses. He grabbed his rifle again and went to the window. It wasn't a mob, it was a procession. At its head was Marshal John Teague. Behind him, riding two abreast, were at least 15 men from Cedar Ridge. He recognized Ben Willis. He saw the baker, the miller, a few ranch hands from smaller spreads. They rode up to the edge of his yard and stopped. Teague dismounted alone, his hands clear of his gun. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready. John. Elias? Teague's gaze swept over the scene, the wounded men, the dead horse, the scorched earth where the kerosene had burned. His face was grim. Heard the shooting, heard what happened. They came to burn us out, Elias said, his voice flat. They shot my animals first. I see that. Teague walked over to where Sela's crow lay. He looked down at him, then at Dale. Ben here rode into town like the devil was on his tail, told the whole saloon what Crow was planning, told them about the little girl. He paused. It stirred something. He turned to face the men on horseback. These men volunteered to ride out with me, to see the law done. One of the riders, the miller, a man named Peterson, spoke up. We ain't all with Hendricks, Vance. We kept quiet too long. We're done keeping quiet. It was the seed Abuela Marisol had spoken of, breaking through the hard soil of fear. The sight of their own blacksmith, burned and shot on a man's doorstep, had been the shock the town needed. The violence had finally become too ugly to ignore. What happens now? Elias asked. Teague took a deep breath. Now I take these two into custody for arson, attempted murder, trespass. Then I go into town and I place Mayor Josiah Hendricks under arrest for conspiracy and corruption. He said it loudly for all to hear. It was a declaration of a new order. There was a murmur of assent from the riders. The balance of power in Cedar Ridge had shifted on a moonlit night. With help from some of the men, they loaded the wounded Crow and the unconscious Dale onto a makeshift travois. As they prepared to leave, Teague pulled Elias aside. It's not over, Elias. Hendricks has that lawyer. He'll fight. He'll drag this through every court he can. I know. But he won't win here, not anymore. Teague looked toward the cabin where Lydia stood silhouetted in the doorway. You'll need to stay close for the trial, both of you. Elias nodded. The idea of staying, of not running, felt foreign and solid at the same time. The men rode back to town, taking the wounded with them. The dawn broke, pale and quiet, over a homestead that felt both ravaged and strangely peaceful. Elias buried his horse. Lydia helped, silently patting dirt over the mound with her small hands. They stayed. Over the next week, a strange thing happened. People came, not to threaten, to help. Ben Willis and a few other hands came out and helped Elias rebuild the Linta stable better than before. Abuela Marisol came with a basket of clothes she had altered to fit a small girl. The miller's wife brought a pie. It was tentative, awkward, but it was real. It was a community trying to atone. Marshal Teague was as good as his word. Josiah Hendricks was arrested in his mercantile the morning after the shootout. He went quietly, his face a stone mask of contempt, confident his money would save him. Arthur Finch, the lawyer, arrived from Omaha and set up a furious defense. The trial was held in Cedar Ridge itself, in the town hall, a month later. The territorial judge who came was not the one who dined with Hendricks. He was a younger man, appointed during a recent reform push. He listened to the evidence with a cold, dispassionate eye. Ben Willis testified about Crow's threats. The miller testified about the economic pressure Hendricks used. Marshal Teague presented the petition Finch had filed, calling it a legalistic attempt to weaponize the court for kidnapping. Abuela Marisol took the stand and spoke softly about the boy who died 2 years before and the bruises that didn't match a fall. And Elias testified. He told the simple, stark truth of what he saw on the porch, of the fear in a little girl's eyes, of the fire, the shots in the night. He didn't embellish. He didn't rage. The facts were damning enough. Lydia did not have to testify. The judge forbade it. The most surprising testimony came from an unexpected source. Midway through the trial, a weary, broken-looking man in threadbare clothes appeared in town. Jade, Lydia's uncle. He had heard the stories, had read about the trial in a newspaper as far away as Kansas City. Guilt, or perhaps fear of being implicated, had driven him back. He took the stand and under oath confessed. He admitted he had been deep in debt to Hendrix's backroom gambling operation. Hendrix had offered to clear the debt in exchange for the girl's indenture contract. Jade had agreed. He named amounts, dates. He shattered Hendrix's claim of benevolent charity. He painted the mayor as the ringleader of a system that trafficked in human misery for profit and control. Finch's elegant legal arguments crumbled under the weight of plain, ugly truth. The verdict was swift. Josiah Hendrix was found guilty of corruption, conspiracy, and fraud. Silas Crow was found guilty of arson and attempted murder. Both were sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in the Territorial Penitentiary. The placement system was formally abolished by the judge's order in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding county. After the gavel fell, Elias stood outside the town hall, Lydia's hand in his. The crowd spilled out around them. There were no cheers. There was a solemn, exhausted relief. The tumor had been cut out, but the scar would remain. Jade approached them, hat in hand. He looked at Lydia, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost pitiable. "Liddy, I'm so sorry." Lydia looked at him, then pressed closer to Elias' side. She didn't speak. She just stared until Jade dropped his gaze, turned, and walked away, disappearing from their story for good. That evening back at the homestead, Elias sat on the rebuilt porch. Lydia came out and sat beside him, swinging her legs. She had started to talk more in the past weeks. Small things, observations about birds, questions about clouds. The flat terror in her eyes was receding, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing his question to Teague from weeks before. Elias looked out over his land. The grass was greening again after the summer heat. His 2 remaining horses grazed peacefully. The cabin behind them was no longer just a claim shack. There was a second chair now. A rag doll from the miller's wife sat on the bed. It was becoming a home. "We live here," he said. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a simple fact settled deep in his bones. "For always. For as long as you want." She thought about that, then nodded, satisfied. She leaned her head against his arm. The silence between them was no longer filled with fear, but with something else, something growing. A week later, Marshal Teague rode out one final time. He handed Elias a set of official papers. "Adoption petition," Teague said gruffly. "Judge signed it this morning, all legal and proper. No one can challenge it. She's your daughter, Elias, in the eyes of the law and from what I can see, in every way that counts." Elias took the papers, the words blurring for a moment. He looked over at Lydia, who was trying to teach a patient old dog to shake. "Thank you, John." "Don't thank me, you did the hard part." Teague mounted up. "Town, looking for a new mayor. Some folks are saying your name." Elias shook his head. "I'm not a mayor, I'm a rancher." Teague smiled, a rare sight. "Maybe that's what we need." He rode off, leaving Elias with the papers in his hand and a future on his land. That final surprising detail came in the late fall. A government man, an agent from the Indian Bureau, arrived at their door. He had been investigating the old reports of child indentures, spurred by the trial records. He asked gentle questions of Lydia about her mother, about her family before her uncle Jade. And he revealed a secret her mother had carried to her grave. Lydia's mother had not been a settler. She had been a half-Lakota woman who had left her tribe to marry a trapper, Lydia's father. When both parents died, Jade was her only living connection to the white world, and he had betrayed her. The agent had documentation, a faded marriage certificate, a tribal roll. He told Elias that Lydia, by blood, had a claim to a small annuity from her mother's tribe and a connection to a people if she ever wanted to explore it. It was a piece of her she never knew she had lost. Elias told her everything that night by the fire. He gave her the agent's letter, the small bundle of documents that were her history. She held them carefully, her brow furrowed in thought. "Does it change anything?" Elias asked. She looked from the papers to his face. She shook her head. "No," she said, with the simple certainty of a child who has finally found her anchor. "You're my pa, this is my home." The division in Cedar Ridge never fully healed, but it scarred over. Some families who had benefited from the old system left, unable to bear the sideways looks. New families moved in, attracted by tales of a town that had fought for what was right. The community was smaller, quieter, perhaps poorer in some ways, but it was its own. And on a ridge 5 miles west, a rancher and his daughter rebuilt their life, not from the ashes of a fire, but from the stronger foundation of a promise kept. The thunder of Elias Vance's intervention had faded into a lasting peace, proving that sometimes the loudest act of all is to finally, quietly stay. The story of Cedar Ridge, Nebraska in 1878 is not recorded in any official history book. You won't find Mayor Hendricks or Silas Crow in any archive. The quiet bravery of a marshal with bad knees, the conscience of an old healer, the slow awakening of a town's soul, these are the fragments that history often sweeps aside. But they are the foundation upon which real communities are built, long after the dust has settled. Elias and Lydia Vance's story asks an uncomfortable, enduring question. What is the true cost of looking away? For years, Cedar Ridge had paid that cost in silent increments. A child's fear, a buried body, a collective shame. It was only when one man, nursing his own private grief, decided the price was too high that the accounting finally came due. His thunderous intervention wasn't just about saving a single girl. It was about forcing an entire community to settle its moral debts. This pattern repeats itself across the hidden corners of history. A system functions because everyone agrees to pretend it's necessary. It continues because the cost of stopping it seems greater than the cost of allowing it. Until one person, often an outsider, often with nothing left to lose, does the math differently. They add up the silent suffering and declare the balance unacceptable. That moment is where progress is born, in the frontier towns of the past and in the complexities of our present. Lydia grew up on that ranch. She married a schoolteacher from Lincoln and had 3 children of her own. She never forgot the porch or the fire or the root cellar. But more importantly, she never forgot the arm she held onto and the promise that was kept. That promise became her inheritance, more valuable than any land or annuity. Elias Vance lived to see his 70s, a respected, if still quiet, figure in a changed community. He never became mayor. He remained a rancher. But he proved that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is to plant themselves in the path of a wrong and simply refuse to move. His legacy wasn't a monument. It was a little girl who grew up knowing she was worth fighting for, and a town that remembered it could be better. So the next time you hear a story that feels too unjust to be real, or witness a quiet compromise with a corrupting system, remember the rancher and the child on the porch. Remember that divisions can be healed, and that thunder, when it comes from a place of pure conviction, can sometimes clear the air for a lasting peace. The most powerful changes often begin not with a crowd, but with a single, unwavering stand. If you want to discover more forgotten stories of courage that reshape the world against all odds, hit that subscribe button right now. We uncover them every week. Thanks for watching.